It's good to come to you today on this first day of Holy Week, the Monday of Holy Week. And I want to bring you a devotional thought from the book of Hebrews, and specifically looking at Hebrews chapter 9, beginning with verse 11. I'm going to read that for us. Hebrews 9, 11 through 15. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, that is not man-made. That is to say, not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but entered the most holy place, once for all, by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls, the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them, so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? And this is the key verse for us today. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. I admit that there's a whole lot of biblical language and imagery there that we've got to unpack. But that key verse for me is verse 15, that Christ is the mediation of a new covenant. So, for starters, let's think about what is a covenant. For me, the best example of a covenant that we have in modern America is the wedding covenant, the marriage covenant. And some of you know that Jill and I just celebrated 20 years last October together. And I've been thinking about that marriage covenant in light of this picture. Covenant is all about relationship. It's all about thinking about our relationship with God. And as we begin to move into this Holy Week season, part of the question that we ask ourselves is, sometimes people just think, why did Jesus have to die? What is the reason Jesus had to die? And if we look at biblical imagery, there's several different images. Here we hear the writer of Hebrews talking about the sacrifice that had to be made, and the Israelites, that was their system of making a way to atone for their sins. That word atone is key, because we use the word atonement to describe what Jesus did for us on the cross. When I think about the word atonement, I think about the church I served in Kansas. The thing that I always remember about that church is that as a seminary student who then got hired to be the youth pastor in that church, there were many, many people in that congregation who were faculty at the seminary. And so anytime I preached, I almost envisioned them as if I were the ice skater out on the ice, and after I preached, they would hold up their numbers and give me an 8 or a 7 or maybe a 10 if I had done well. And often what actually happened is that they would line up after the sermon and come and talk to me. And they were very gracious. And they would give me feedback. I had history professors and theology professors and New Testament professors who were a part of the congregation. And their help, they were very helpful as they would come, but it was still intimidating. One of those faculty members in particular, who has since passed on, his name is Rob Staples. I remember vividly, we were at a church potluck, and he says to me, "So what are they teaching you these days?" He was the retired theology professor from the seminary. "What are they teaching you these days about atonement?" And I thought to myself, oh my, I am now getting tested on what I know. And I explained to Rob, using as big of words as I could, what had been learning in my theology class. And he said something to me that really stuck with me. He said, "That's great. That's great that they're teaching you all these different ways to think about atonement. Because what I'm convinced of is that atonement, our understanding of what Jesus has done for us, is shaped by the world around us and the culture that we're a part of. That the people of the Old Testament, they really thought about Jesus' sacrifice and his death on the cross purely in terms of the practices of sacrificing animals and the blood that was shed in those sacrifices. That's really hard for our modern American sensibilities to make sense of. But when we think about Jesus' death on the cross, completely through the lens of covenant, I think it makes more sense. The other problem when we use some of the other images that theologians sometimes use when they talk about what Jesus did on the cross for us is they'll talk about the debt that was owed to God, and that's biblical. Or they'll talk about balancing the heavenly accounts by the merits of Christ's death. And again, biblical. But what happens sometimes when we start talking about why Jesus died on the cross in those terms is that we often, it leads us to describing God's wrath in confusing ways. And we end up pitting the God of the Old Testament against the God of the New Testament, Jesus. And somehow God of the Old Testament and Jesus is somehow appeasing God's anger and wrath through his death. And I don't find that helpful when I'm trying to think, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? But when I think about covenant, again, let me read this verse. Verse 15 of chapter 9. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. So you see, God started the first covenant with God's people through Abraham and promised that they would be blessed and that Abraham and Sarah would have children that they couldn't even count. So many that the blessing of that covenant. But humanity broke that covenant. First through Adam and then through Abraham and his descendants, they broke that covenant. And when we think about what Jesus did for us on the cross, when we think about why Jesus had to die, it comes down to this issue of new covenant. New covenant in the form of relationship restored. When I think about my marriage covenant with Jill, I recognize that if I were ever to do something to jeopardize that covenant relationship, that I would have to go to her and be the one to come to her to try to restore that relationship. God forbid that would ever happen. But here's the crazy thing about Jesus' death on the cross, is that even though we're the ones who broke relationship with God, God makes that first step. Through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God makes a way to restore that relationship with us. One of the things that I love about communion, and we're going to get to celebrate communion together in our homes this Friday night at 7 o'clock. The service will start. One of the things I love about communion is when we use the words that Jesus himself used to describe communion. And he used this phrase, the blood of the new covenant. That when we think about Jesus' blood through the lens of relationship, when we think about Jesus' death through the restoration of relationship and the restoration of the covenant, that the old covenant has been replaced and a new covenant is in place. That I don't have to be the one who goes to God and tries to make that relationship right again. Instead, God comes to me and to you and offers that gift of restored relationship with God. And so as we think about this week, as we move towards Easter, and maybe you have asked the question, why did Jesus have to die? Well, it was a choice and a gift that God gave us, that he chose to present his own blood as a way of restoring the relationship. That his own death and resurrection gave us victory over death. And we can emphasize this nature of new relationship with God that's available to each of us because of what Jesus has done for us. So I hope that's encouraging to you today. As you think about Easter coming, and as you think about, why did Jesus die for me? He died for me so that I could have restored relationship with him.